Crimes of bribery, obstruction of justice, this court sentences you to 15 years in federal prison.
58-year-old Carolyn Taylor, a trailblazing circuit court judge, corrupted the justice system for over a decade, manipulating dozens of cases to favor family members, close friends, and select defendants, while crushing others with maximum sentences. The courtroom had been her kingdom for 22 years, a place where she commanded absolute respect, where attorneys stood when she entered, where her word was law. But on this November afternoon, everything changed. Colleagues would later recall the eerie tension as Judge Robert V. Adams read the sentence, Taylor sitting rigidly at the defendant's table where so many had trembled before her. What began as a distinguished judicial career ended in an explosive meltdown. Taylor lunging from her chair, screaming accusations, clawing at officers as they dragged her across the courtroom floor, her elegant dress tearing, her composure shattered. Before we examine how FBI investigators exposed this stunning fall from grace, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel for more in-depth crime stories. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments below. 22 years before her spectacular courtroom meltdown, Carolyn Taylor made history. At 36 years old, she became the first woman of color appointed to the circuit court bench in her jurisdiction. Flashbulbs popped as the governor shook her hand. Community leaders called it a breakthrough moment. Young lawyers, especially women and minorities who'd spent careers hitting glass ceilings, finally saw someone who looked like them wearing the black robe. Taylor's journey to that bench read like something out of a movie. She'd grown up in the roughest part of the city, where police sirens were the neighborhood soundtrack and corner stores had bulletproof glass. Her father did 2 stretches in state prison, one for theft, another for violating probation. She watched her older brother get railroaded by a public defender who spent maybe 20 minutes on his case before he took a plea deal that gave him 8 years. The judge never looked up from his papers when he approved it. Those experiences lit a fire in Taylor. She worked overnight shifts at a grocery store and weekend doubles at a diner to pay her way through community college, then state university, then law school. Sleep became a luxury she couldn't afford. Her classmates partied on Friday nights, while she highlighted case law under fluorescent lights in the library, fueled by cheap coffee and determination. After passing the bar, Taylor joined the district attorney's office. She prosecuted domestic violence cases, drug offenses, robbery, assault. Defense attorneys learned quickly that she didn't mess around. She came to court prepared, knew every detail of her cases, and rarely lost. Victims appreciated her directness. She told them the truth about what conviction rates looked like, what sentences they could realistically expect, and she fought hard in front of juries. 7 years in the prosecutor's office. Then she switched sides. Joined a mid-sized firm doing criminal defense and civil rights work. She represented clients who couldn't afford the big downtown lawyers, took on police misconduct cases, fought for people the system usually chewed up and spit out. Her reputation grew. When a circuit court seat opened up, dozens of organizations backed her appointment. She was confirmed unanimously. Judge Taylor's courtroom became known throughout the legal community. She ran a tight ship, started proceedings exactly on time, tolerated zero nonsense from attorneys who showed up unprepared, and moved through her docket faster than any other judge in the building. Defendants appreciated that she actually listened. She'd ask questions, dig into the details of their cases, seem genuinely interested in understanding the circumstances that brought them before her. Prosecutors and defense attorneys alike called her tough but fair. Her sentences reflected the facts, or so it seemed. Outside the courtroom, Taylor became a fixture at law schools, career days at inner-city high schools, bar association events. She mentored young attorneys, especially women of color trying to navigate a profession that still felt like an old boys' club. Awards piled up on her chamber's shelves. Magazine profiles called her an inspiration. But whispers started circulating. Quiet conversations over drinks after court, defense attorneys comparing notes. Taylor's sentences seemed unpredictable. One defendant with a minor drug charge got hammered with 5 years. Another with a worse record walked out with probation. Her nephew's aggravated assault case, a brutal beating that left a college student hospitalized, disappeared from the docket with barely a mention. Nobody could quite put their finger on it, but something felt off. Chapter 2. The pattern emerges. Michael Rodriguez slammed his beer down harder than he meant to. The bartender glanced over, but Rodriguez barely noticed. He'd just lost another client to what felt like a rigged game, and he was done keeping quiet about it. 10 years, he said to the 3 defense attorneys squeezed into the booth with him. My guy gets 10 years for possession with intent. First offense, no weapon, no violence, clean record except for a couple traffic tickets. 10 years. Sarah Chen, who'd been practicing criminal defense for 15 years, shook her head. Let me guess. Taylor? Who else? Rodriguez pulled out his phone, scrolling through case notes. I've had 6 cases in front of her this year. Every single client got maximum or near maximum sentences. Meanwhile, I'm watching other defendants walk out with probation for worse charges. The attorneys exchanged glances. They'd all noticed it. But saying it out loud felt dangerous. Judges had long memories, and accusing one of bias could torpedo your career. There's a pattern, offered James Mitchell, a younger attorney who still had student loans he'd be paying off until retirement. I started keeping track 3 months ago. It's not random. He pulled up a spreadsheet on his laptop. Names, charges, sentences, connections. The data told a story that made Rodriguez's stomach turn. Taylor had sentenced Rodriguez's client, a 23-year-old kid caught with pills he planned to sell, to a decade behind bars. 1 week later, she gave probation to a repeat offender with 3 prior drug convictions. The difference? That second defendant was the cousin of Taylor's former law clerk. Mitchell had the court documents to prove it. Look at this one, Chen added, pointing to another entry. Assault case. My client threw 1 punch in a bar fight. The other guy needed 6 stitches. Taylor gave him 3 years. 2 months earlier, she sentenced someone for aggravated assault, broken ribs, fractured skull, victim hospitalized for a week, to 18 months. Guess who that defendant's attorney was? Don't tell me, Rodriguez said. Taylor's former law school roommate. The pattern couldn't be ignored anymore. Defendants with connections to Taylor, family friends, members of her community organizations, clients of attorneys she'd worked with, consistently received lighter sentences. Those without connections, especially if they came from different backgrounds, got crushed. The numbers didn't lie. Rodriguez spent the next 2 weeks gathering every scrap of documentation he could find. Case files, sentencing transcripts, background information on defendants who'd received unusually lenient treatment. He cross-referenced family connections, professional relationships, shared community ties. The correlation was impossible to miss. Filing the complaint with the Judicial Oversight Board felt like jumping off a cliff. Rodriguez sat in his car outside the government building for 20 minutes, finger hovering over the submit button on his laptop. Accusing a sitting judge of corruption could end his career, but watching innocent people get steamrolled while guilty ones walked free was eating him alive. He clicked submit. The Oversight Board forwarded the complaint to the FBI's Public Corruption Unit within 48 hours. Special Agent Marcus Chen, a 15-year veteran who'd taken down crooked politicians, dirty cops, and corporate fraudsters, read through Rodriguez's documentation with growing interest. The statistical anomalies jumped off the page. A 99.7% correlation between personal connections and favorable outcomes wasn't just suspicious. It was mathematically impossible in an impartial courtroom. Chen assembled a small team. They'd need to move carefully. Investigating a sitting judge meant navigating political minefields, legal complexities, and the very real possibility that Taylor had allies who'd try to shut down the investigation before it gained traction. but the evidence Rodriguez provided gave them enough to start pulling threads. Within a week, subpoenas went out for Taylor's financial records, email accounts, and phone logs. The investigation was officially underway, though Taylor didn't know it yet. She'd continue presiding over cases, dispensing her version of justice, completely unaware that federal agents were building a case that would destroy everything she'd spent decades constructing. Dr. Sarah Kim had analyzed corruption cases for the FBI for 12 years, but she'd never seen numbers like this. Sitting in her cubicle at the field office, surrounded by monitors displaying spreadsheets and statistical models, she ran the analysis for the third time. Same result. The probability calculations didn't lie. Agent Chen stood behind her, arms crossed, watching the data populate across her screen. Walk me through it again. Kim pulled up the master spreadsheet. I analyzed 847 cases Judge Taylor presided over during the last 10 years. Criminal cases only, everything from misdemeanors to felonies. I coded each defendant based on whether they had any connection to Taylor. Family members, friends, people from her community organizations, clients of attorneys she had personal relationships with. Then I compared their sentences to defendants with no connections. She clicked to a chart that showed two dramatically different distribution curves. In an impartial courtroom, there should be essentially zero correlation between personal connections and sentencing outcomes. Maybe you'd see a 2% or 3% variation due to random chance. That's normal statistical noise. And what did you find? A 99.7% correlation. Kim let that sink in. Defendants with connections to Taylor received favorable outcomes. Reduced charges, probation instead of prison time, suspended sentences. In virtually every case, those without connections got hammered. Maximum sentences, no leniency, no second chances. Chen leaned closer to the screen. What's the probability that happens randomly? Less than 1 in 10 million. Statistically speaking, this doesn't occur by accident. Ever. Kim pulled up another graph showing sentence lengths. Look at these assault cases. Similar charges, similar criminal histories. Defendants with no Taylor connection averaged 6.3 years. Defendants with connections averaged 1.2 years. Some got probation for crimes that typically carry double-digit prison time. The evidence was damning, but Chen needed specifics. Individual cases that would resonate with a jury, make the corruption tangible rather than abstract. Kim had those too. Marcus Taylor, the judge's nephew. Kim opened a case file. March 2019, aggravated assault outside a nightclub. Witnesses said he beat a college student unconscious over a parking space dispute. Victim ended up with a broken jaw, 3 fractured ribs, concussion. Spent 4 days in the hospital. What did he get? Probation. 18-month supervised probation and anger management classes. Kim pulled up sentencing guidelines. This type of assault typically carries 10 to 15 years. The prosecutor recommended 12. Taylor gave him probation and told the victim's family that boys will be boys, that her nephew made a mistake but didn't deserve to have his life ruined. Chen had interviewed that victim's mother 2 days earlier. She'd sat across from him in a coffee shop, hands shaking, as she described watching her son relearn how to eat solid food. The doctor said he might have permanent nerve damage in his jaw. Marcus Taylor was back at his sales job 6 months later, like nothing happened. The FBI expanded the investigation immediately. Subpoenas went out for Taylor's financial records, every bank account, credit card, investment portfolio. They pulled her emails, both official court correspondence and personal accounts. Phone records going back 5 years, text messages, social media. The digital dragnet captured everything. What they found went beyond favoritism. Defense attorney David Greenfield had won 12 straight acquittals in Taylor's courtroom over 3 years. A statistical impossibility given the strength of the evidence in those cases. His law firm had paid $27,000 to a consulting LLC registered to Taylor's husband. The payments were described as legal research fees, but Greenfield's firm already employed a full research staff. Another attorney, Patricia Womack, had represented 17 defendants before Taylor. 15 received probation or reduced charges. Womack's bank records showed cash deposits totaling $43,000 over 2 years, always in amounts just under the $10,000 reporting threshold. When agents interviewed her, she claimed the money came from private clients paying in cash. She couldn't name a single one. The corruption ran deeper than anyone expected. Taylor hadn't just bent the rules. She'd built an entire system of payoffs, favors, and coordinated outcomes. Justice in her courtroom wasn't blind. It had a price tag. The forensic accountant flagged the offshore account at 2:37 in the morning. She'd been digging through financial records for 6 straight hours, cross-referencing shell companies and wire transfers when she found it. An account in the Cayman Islands registered to something called Fairview Judicial Consulting LLC. The owner? Carolyn Taylor. Agent Chen got the call at 3 a.m. By sunrise, his team had traced over $890,000 flowing into that account over 8 years. The money came in irregular chunks, always described as consulting fees, always from law firms that regularly appeared in Taylor's courtroom. But here's what made it interesting. Those payments came right after improbable victories. David Greenfield's firm led the pack. 12 straight acquittals in cases that should have been slam dunks for prosecutors. After each win, his firm wired between $15,000 and $30,000 to Taylor's LLC. The timing was almost comically obvious. Acquittal on Monday, payment on Friday. Acquittal in March, payment in April. The pattern repeated like clockwork. But the money trail was just the beginning. What the FBI found in Taylor's emails turned a corruption case into something that would make prosecutors salivate. The IT forensics team recovered thousands of deleted messages from Taylor's personal email account. She'd used the same password, her daughter's name plus her birth year, for everything, which made the FBI's job embarrassingly easy. One email to Greenfield, sent 3 weeks before a high-profile fraud trial, contained 6 words that would later be read aloud in federal court. Push the trial date to next month. I'll make sure the right outcome happens. The right outcome. Taylor had put it in writing. No coded language, no plausible deniability, just a sitting judge promising to fix a trial. Other emails showed coordination that would have impressed organized crime bosses. Taylor discussing which prosecutors were manageable and which ones asked too many questions. Messages about shuffling cases to her courtroom instead of judges who might actually follow the law. A thread with another attorney detailing exactly how to phrase motions so Taylor could grant them without raising red flags. Then investigators hit the mother lode. A laptop seized from Taylor's home office contained a document titled Case Management 2019 to 2023. The FBI analyst who opened it actually called Chen over to look at it. They stood there in silence, reading what amounted to a corruption ledger disguised as a spreadsheet. The document tracked defendants by name, ethnicity, family connections to Taylor, and, this part was particularly damning, financial arrangements. Color-coded rows indicated who'd paid, who owed favors, who had family ties. Notes in the margin referenced specific sentencing decisions. Marcus, probation-only family, next to her nephew's assault case. Greenfield client, acquittal promised, $25K pending next to a DUI case where the defendant had blown twice the legal limit. Taylor had literally kept score. Every favor, every fixed verdict, every compromised decision documented in her own hand. Defense attorneys dream about evidence this clean. The recorded phone calls sealed it. FBI wiretaps, authorized after the initial financial discoveries, captured Taylor coaching her brother-in-law's business partner through testimony 2 days before his trial. In her courtroom, for embezzlement charges backed by rock-solid evidence. When they ask about the transfers, you say you were consolidating accounts. Taylor's voice came through crystal clear on the recording. I'll sustain any objection about your financial records being too complicated for the jury. Trust me, I've done this before. You'll walk out of there a free man. He did walk. The jury acquitted him despite bank records showing he'd stolen $340,000 from his employer. 3 weeks later, $20,000 appeared in Taylor's offshore account, wired from a consulting firm her brother-in-law owned. Prosecutors building the case against Taylor now had everything. Statistical proof of systematic bias, financial records showing hundreds of thousands in payoffs, emails coordinating fixed verdicts, recorded phone calls of jury tampering, a literal spreadsheet tracking her corruption by race and relationship. The question wasn't whether Taylor was guilty. The question was how she'd managed to get away with it for so long. Brandon Mitchell's jaw still clicks when he chews. 3 years after the assault, doctors told him the nerve damage would probably be permanent. He sat across from FBI agents in a victim advocacy office, running his finger along the scar that traced from his ear to his chin, and tried to explain what it felt like watching his attacker walk free. The judge looked right at me when she gave him probation, Mitchell said, his voice tight. She said boys will be boys. That Marcus made a mistake but shouldn't have his whole life ruined over one bad decision. One bad decision? He stomped on my head while I was unconscious. The EMTs said another minute and I might have died in that parking lot. Marcus Taylor, the judge's nephew, never spent a single night in jail. Mitchell spent 4 days in the hospital and 6 months relearning how to eat normally. The assault that should have carried 10 to 15 years got downgraded to probation and anger management classes. Mitchell's family hired a lawyer to appeal the sentence. That lawyer told them appeals of judicial discretion almost never succeed, especially when the judge is as respected as Carolyn Taylor. The FBI interviewed 17 victims whose cases had been manipulated in Taylor's courtroom. Each story hit harder than the last. A robbery victim whose attacker, connected to Taylor through a community organization, got charges dismissed despite being caught on camera. An elderly couple defrauded out of their retirement savings by a financial advisor who walked free after Taylor ruled the evidence inadmissible on a technicality nobody could explain. A domestic violence survivor who watched her abuser get a suspended sentence because he happened to be the son of Taylor's former law clerk. Dr. Patricia Chen, a forensic psychologist who'd spent 20 years analyzing criminal behavior, studied Taylor's pattern for the prosecution. What she found was a textbook case of corrupted idealism twisted into systematic abuse. Judge Taylor faced real discrimination early in her career. Dr. Chen explained in a deposition that would later be played at trial. She watched her father get railroaded by the system. Her brother took a plea deal because his public defender didn't fight for him. These weren't paranoid fantasies. This was genuine injustice that shaped her worldview. But somewhere along the way, according to Dr. Chen, Taylor's desire to fix a broken system morphed into something darker. She began viewing herself as a corrective force, someone who could balance the scales by giving advantages to people who looked like her, came from her community, shared her background. In her mind, she wasn't corrupting justice. She was finally making it fair. This is classic compartmentalization, Dr. Chen continued. Taylor saw herself as Robin Hood, taking from the system that had oppressed her community and giving back to those who'd been historically disadvantaged. She genuinely believed she was doing the right thing. Except her version of justice had victims. Real people who got crushed because they didn't have the right connections or weren't part of the right community. A 19-year-old kid doing 10 years for drug possession while repeat offenders with ties to Taylor walked free. An assault victim with permanent injuries watching his attacker avoid consequences because of family connections. A business owner who lost everything to fraud that Taylor deemed not worthy of punishment. The financial motive complicated the psychology. Taylor wasn't just playing Robin Hood. She was getting rich doing it. That offshore account didn't fill itself. Defense attorneys paid for favorable verdicts, and Taylor delivered. The consulting fees, the cash deposits, the wire transfers. They painted a picture of someone who'd convinced herself that taking money was justified because the system owed her. One case captured the complete moral collapse. Taylor's cousin filed for custody of her ex-husband's kids despite Child Protective Services documenting concerns about drug use and neglect. Taylor assigned the case to herself, dismissed the CPS reports as exaggerated, and granted full custody. 6 months later, one of those children ended up in the emergency room with bruises, CPS said, were consistent with abuse. The ex-husband's lawyer tried to get the custody order reversed. Taylor denied every motion. Another family friend, someone Taylor had known since law school, was caught embezzling $200,000 from the nonprofit he ran. He confessed, signed a statement admitting everything. Taylor ruled the confession was coerced and inadmissible. The case fell apart. He walked out of her courtroom and went back to work. That nonprofit served homeless veterans. The human cost couldn't be calculated in spreadsheets. Faith in the justice system, already fragile in communities that had been historically mistreated, shattered completely. Defense attorneys who played by the rules watched clients get maximum sentences, while connected defendants got sweetheart deals. Victims who trusted the system to deliver justice learned that courthouse marble and black robes didn't guarantee fairness. Sometimes they just provided cover for corruption with better credentials. March 15th, 2023. Started like any other Wednesday in Judge Carolyn Taylor's courtroom. She was halfway through a routine sentencing hearing, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed a pre-sentence investigation report, when the courtroom doors opened with more force than usual. 6 FBI agents walked in wearing tactical vests with the Bureau's letters blazing across their chests. The defendant's attorney stopped mid-sentence. The court reporter's fingers froze above her keyboard. Every head in the room turned toward the agents moving down the center aisle, with the purposeful stride of people who knew exactly what they were doing. Taylor looked up, annoyed at the interruption. "This is a closed proceeding. You'll need to—" Judge Carolyn Taylor. Agent Marcus Chen's voice cut through the courtroom's stunned silence. He held up credentials in one hand and an arrest warrant in the other. "We need you to step down from the bench." For maybe 5 seconds, Taylor just stared. Her brain couldn't process what was happening. FBI agents didn't walk into courtrooms and interrupt judges. That wasn't how this worked. She was the one with power here. She controlled this room. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice carrying that tone she used when attorneys filed stupid motions. "I'm a judge. Whatever this is about, you need to contact my chambers and schedule—" "Not anymore." Chen moved closer to the bench, the arrest warrant now clearly visible. "Judge Carolyn Taylor, you're under arrest for bribery, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and deprivation of civil rights under color of law. You need to come down from there. Now." The color drained from Taylor's face. Around the courtroom, people pulled out phones. This was about to be everywhere. Chen gestured for her to stand. When she didn't move, 2 agents walked around to the side entrance that led to her chambers. "We can do this quietly, or we can do it in front of everyone," Chen said. "Your choice." Taylor stood on shaking legs. 22 years she'd sat on this bench. She'd sentenced hundreds of people from this exact spot, watched them led away in handcuffs, never imagining she'd make the same walk. The agents guided her down the steps where defendants usually stood trembling before her. Chen read her rights, words she'd heard attorneys recite thousands of times, now being spoken directly to her. The perp walk through the courthouse lasted forever. Every hallway Taylor had walked through commanding respect, now lined with her former colleagues, attorneys who'd appeared before her, court staff who'd once jumped when she asked for something. Some looked shocked. Others couldn't hide their satisfaction. The judge who'd ruled with an iron fist was being led out in handcuffs. Camera flashes exploded as they emerged from the building. News crews had gotten word somehow. They always did. Taylor kept her head down, but the images would be everywhere within an hour. The trailblazing judge, the community champion, the mentor to young lawyers, now just another defendant doing the perp walk. Processing at FBI headquarters was methodical and humiliating. Fingerprints, mugshot, property inventory. They took her jewelry, her watch, the designer purse that cost more than most of her defendants could earn in a month. Taylor sat in an interview room and said nothing except, "I want my attorney." Smart play, but it didn't matter. The evidence didn't need her cooperation. The bail hearing happened that same afternoon before Judge Robert V. Adams, who'd sat 2 doors down from Taylor for 15 years. They'd attended judicial conferences together, grabbed lunch between hearings, complained about the same bureaucratic nonsense. Now Adams had to decide whether his colleague would await trial in a cell or at home. Federal prosecutor Jennifer Morrison didn't mince words. "Your Honor, the defendant has demonstrated a pattern of obstruction and abuse of authority spanning over a decade. She manipulated cases, coordinated with attorneys to fix verdicts, and used her position to enrich herself and protect associates. Given her connections throughout the legal system and substantial financial resources, including offshore accounts, she presents a significant flight risk." Taylor's attorney argued about her roots in the community, her decades of service, her lack of criminal history. Adams listened to both sides, his face revealing nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone doing something he'd never wanted to do. "The evidence presented suggests a systematic abuse of judicial authority. The defendant used her position not to uphold justice, but to subvert it. Given the pattern of obstruction and the seriousness of the charges, bail is denied." That's when Taylor's composure finally cracked. Not in fury, not yet. That would come later. This was pure disbelief giving way to dawning horror. She'd be held at the federal detention center until trial. No bail, no going home. She was just another defendant now, subject to the same system she'd manipulated for years. In her cell that night, corrections officers reported hearing her crying for the first time. The mask had slipped. By morning, headlines screamed across every news outlet, "Champion judge or corrupt tyrant." Her fall from grace had officially begun. September brought cooler weather and the trial everyone had been waiting for. Courtroom 6B filled an hour before proceedings started. Journalists, lawyers, victims' families, curious citizens who'd followed the case since Taylor's arrest. Judge Robert V. Adams walked in at exactly 9 a.m., his face betraying nothing. 6 months ago, he and Taylor had shared lunch in the courthouse cafeteria, complaining about budget cuts and administrative headaches. Now he'd preside over her prosecution. Federal Prosecutor Jennifer Morrison stood to deliver opening statements, and you could hear the determination in her voice. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about a judge who turned justice into a commodity, who sold verdicts to the highest bidder and manipulated outcomes based on race, family connections, and personal profit. The evidence will show that Judge Taylor didn't just bend the rules. She shattered them systematically, deliberately, for over a decade. Day 3 brought Dr. Sarah Kim to the stand. The FBI analyst pulled up her statistical analysis on courtroom monitors, and the numbers told a story that couldn't be explained away. Morrison walked her through it methodically. Dr. Kim, what did your analysis of Judge Taylor's 847 cases reveal? A 99.7% correlation between personal connections to Judge Taylor and favorable outcomes. Kim's voice was steady, clinical. In an impartial courtroom, that correlation should be essentially zero. The probability of this occurring randomly is less than 1 in 10 million. The defense attorney tried to punch holes in the methodology during cross-examination, suggesting the sample size was too small or the coding was biased. Kim shut it down with the patience of someone who defended her work 1,000 times. The math didn't lie, and the jury could see it. But statistics only go so far. The prosecution needed faces, voices, real people whose lives Taylor had destroyed. They got that with Brandon Mitchell's mother. Mrs. Mitchell walked to the stand carrying a photo of her son from before the assault, smiling, healthy, whole. She described watching Marcus Taylor walk out of court with probation while her son was still relearning how to chew solid food. Her voice broke when Morrison asked about Taylor's reaction to the sentence. The judge smiled at Marcus, told him she was proud he was taking responsibility and moving forward with his life. My son was sitting right there with his jaw wired shut, and she smiled at the man who did that to him. The financial evidence came next. A forensic accountant traced $890,000 through offshore accounts, shell companies, and consulting arrangements that existed only on paper. Defense attorney David Greenfield's firm paid Taylor $127,000 after 12 straight improbable acquittals. Patricia Womack made cash deposits always just under the reporting threshold. The money trail was impossible to deny. Then Morrison played the emails, Taylor's own words, projected on screens throughout the courtroom. Push the trial date to next month. I'll make sure the right outcome happens. There was no explaining that away, no context that made it innocent. Taylor had put her corruption in writing. The defense strategy became clear during their presentation. Claim the entire investigation was racially motivated persecution of a groundbreaking black female judge who'd finally brought balance to a system stacked against her community. When Taylor took the stand in her own defense, she came out swinging. I spent 22 years watching the system crush people who looked like me, she said, her voice strong. I saw young black and brown defendants get maximum sentences while wealthy white defendants got country club prisons or probation. Yes, I helped my community. Yes, I gave people second chances. That's not corruption. That's finally providing balance in a racist system. It would have been a powerful statement if Morrison hadn't been ready for it. The cross-examination was surgical and brutal. Judge Taylor, Brandon Mitchell is African American, correct? Yes. And your nephew Marcus, who assaulted him and received probation, is also African American? Yes. So when you gave your nephew probation and smiled at him while Mr. Mitchell sat in your courtroom with his jaw wired shut, you weren't balancing racial injustice. You were protecting family, weren't you? Taylor's jaw tightened. That's not... Let me ask about another case. Morrison pulled up a file. David Chen, Asian American defendant, first-time drug offense, no connections to you. You sentenced him to 10 years. 1 week later, you gave probation to James Wilson, also African American, third-time drug offender. Mr. Wilson's attorney had paid your consulting LLC $25,000 the month before. Was that balancing racial injustice, or was that a payoff? The questions kept coming. Each one dismantled Taylor's defense, showing case after case where race didn't explain the favoritism. Money and connections did. By the time Morrison finished, Taylor's narrative of being a champion for her community lay in ruins. The evidence showed something uglier. A judge who'd used real historical injustice to justify personal corruption and enrichment. The jury would have to decide whether they believed Taylor's story of balancing scales or the prosecution's evidence of systematic bribery and manipulation. Based on the faces in the jury box, that decision looked pretty clear. The jury got the case at 9:47 a.m. on October 18th. By noon, they still hadn't reached a verdict. By 3 p.m., the waiting had turned agonizing. Victims' families paced the courthouse hallways. Journalists camped outside the deliberation room. Defense attorneys tried to read the tea leaves. Long deliberations usually favored the defense, right? Maybe the jury was hung on some counts. Agent Chen wasn't buying it. He'd watched those jurors during Dr. Kim's testimony, seen their faces when the emails were read aloud. They weren't struggling with whether Taylor was guilty. They were making sure they got every detail right. At 8:52 p.m., after 11 hours of deliberation, the buzzer sounded. The jury had reached a verdict. Courtroom 6B filled faster than a nightclub on Saturday night. Victims' families rushed back from dinner. Attorneys who'd been monitoring from their offices sprinted through the courthouse doors. Media crews set up cameras in the hallway. By the time Judge Adams took the bench, standing room only didn't begin to describe it. Court officers had to turn people away. Taylor sat at the defense table in a navy suit, her hands folded in front of her. From a distance, she looked composed, the same controlled presence she'd maintained throughout the trial. But if you were close enough, you could see her fingers trembling, the way she kept swallowing like her mouth had gone dry. The jury filed in. None of them looked at Taylor. Prosecutors knew what that meant. Defense attorneys knew too. Adams's voice cut through the tension. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman, a high school principal who'd spent 3 weeks listening to evidence of corruption, stood. We have, Your Honor. On count 1, bribery of a public official, how do you find? Guilty. Taylor's face didn't change, but her lawyer put a hand on her shoulder. Count 2, conspiracy to obstruct justice? Guilty. The foreman kept reading. Guilty on count 3. Guilty on count 4. Guilty on all 14 counts. Bribery, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, wire fraud. Each guilty verdict landed like a hammer blow. By count 7, Taylor's stone face started cracking. By count 12, tears were streaming down her cheeks, though she made no sound. When the foreman finished, Adams thanked the jury for their service and set sentencing for 3 weeks out. Then he did something unusual. He made a statement right there before dismissing everyone. This verdict affirms a principle that sits at the foundation of our justice system. Justice must be blind. Not to race, not to family, not to any connection beyond the facts and the law. When a judge violates that principle, when someone entrusted with administering justice instead corrupts it for personal gain and favoritism, they strike at the very heart of what makes our system legitimate. His words hung in the courtroom. Adams had just said what everyone was thinking. This wasn't about prosecuting a black female judge. This was about holding accountable someone who'd betrayed an oath. Outside the courthouse, the reaction split along predictable lines. Community activists who had supported Taylor throughout the trial faced news cameras and called it a travesty. Persecution of a groundbreaking jurist who'd tried to bring fairness to a biased system. They pointed to her decades of service, her role as the first woman of color on that bench. The real discrimination she'd faced climbing to that position. But across the street, victims' families told a different story. Brandon Mitchell's mother embraced the prosecutor, crying into her shoulder. "Finally," she kept saying, "finally someone acknowledged what was taken from us." The father, whose retirement savings had been stolen by Taylor's family friend, spoke to reporters with a mixture of relief and residual anger. "Justice delayed is justice denied. And we were denied for years while that judge protected the man who destroyed our lives. Today at least validates that what happened to us was wrong." Inside the courthouse, Taylor sat in a holding cell waiting to be transported back to detention. The mask she'd worn throughout the trial had completely shattered. Guards reported her alternating between rage and despair, screaming about persecution one minute and crying the next. The woman who'd commanded courtrooms with absolute authority had finally confronted the reality that she'd be going to prison. Not as a judge, not as a community leader, but as a convicted felon. 14 guilty verdicts. The jury had believed the evidence, rejected the defense's narrative, and sent a clear message. No amount of past discrimination justified systematic corruption. No role as a trailblazer excused manipulating justice for profit and favoritism. The law applied to everyone, even judges who thought they were above it. Sentencing was 3 weeks away, but everyone knew Taylor was facing serious time. Federal sentencing guidelines for public corruption didn't mess around. The only question left was how much time and whether she'd accept responsibility or keep claiming she'd been a victim of persecution. Based on her reaction to the verdict, accepting responsibility seemed unlikely. November 3rd dawned cold and gray, the kind of morning that matched the mood inside courtroom 6B. Sentencing day had arrived, and everyone knew this wasn't going to be pretty. Victims who'd waited years for acknowledgement filled the gallery. Media crews lined the hallway 3 deep. Court officers had been briefed to expect trouble. Taylor's behavior in detention had been increasingly erratic, swinging between rage and denial. The victim impact statement started at 10 a.m. and didn't let up for 2 hours. Brandon Mitchell went first, standing at the podium with visible effort. His jaw still clicked when he talked. 3 years later, doctors said it always would. "I can't eat steak anymore," he told Judge Adams, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "Can't chew anything tough. I get headaches that last for days. But the physical stuff isn't even the worst part. The worst part is knowing that the person who did this to me walked away laughing because his aunt was the judge. That's what breaks you, knowing the system that's supposed to protect you was rigged from the start." Then came Marcus Webb, who'd spent 6 years in prison for armed robbery he didn't commit. His case had ended up in Taylor's courtroom after an appeal. The evidence clearing him was solid. Alibi witnesses, phone records putting him across the city when the robbery happened, another man's fingerprints on the weapon. Taylor denied his appeal anyway. No connections, no leniency. "I lost 6 years, Webb said, gripping the podium so hard his knuckles went white. "My daughter was 9 when I went in. She was 15 when I got out. I missed her entire childhood because Judge Taylor decided my life didn't matter. The Innocence Project finally got me released, but those years are gone forever." Prosecutor Morrison's recommendation was blunt and unforgiving. "Your Honor, Judge Taylor didn't just break laws. She shattered faith in justice itself. She took the sacred trust placed in her and weaponized it for personal gain. She sold verdicts, protected violent criminals with family connections, and sent innocent people to prison. The recommended sentence is 15 years, and given the scope and duration of her crimes, the government believes that's appropriate. The defense attorney made his pitch for leniency, emphasizing Taylor's groundbreaking role as the first woman of color on that bench, the discrimination she genuinely faced, her decades of community service before the corruption began. He painted a picture of someone who'd started with good intentions before losing her way. She deserves accountability, he argued, but she also deserves recognition for the barriers she broke, the young lawyers she mentored, the contributions she made before her judgment became clouded. Judge Adams listened to everything. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd thought long and hard about what he was going to say. Judge Taylor, you were given a sacred trust, the power to determine people's liberty, their futures, their lives. You used that trust to create your own system of favorites and enemies. You sold justice to the highest bidder and manipulated outcomes based on race, family connections, and personal profit. No prior achievement, no matter how significant, excuses that betrayal. He paused, looking directly at Taylor for the first time. The court sentences you to 15 years in federal prison on each count, to run concurrently. 15 years. That's when Taylor exploded. She shot up from her chair like she'd been electrocuted, screaming words that started as denial and quickly devolved into pure rage. This is persecution. You're lynching me because I finally gave our people justice. You can't stand seeing a strong black woman. Her attorney tried to pull her back down, but she shoved him away. Court officers moved toward the defense table, but Taylor was already lunging toward the bench, arms outstretched like she was going to physically attack Adams. Two officers caught her mid-stride, wrestling her to the floor as she screamed about racism and conspiracy. The scene was absolute chaos. Taylor thrashing on the courtroom floor, her carefully styled hair coming loose, her dress riding up as she tried to claw her way toward the bench, officers struggling to restrain her without hurting her. The gallery erupting in gasps and shouts, cameras in the hallway capturing every second of the meltdown. "You'll regret this," Taylor screamed as officers dragged her toward the side door. Her voice had gone hoarse from the volume. "I was the only one with the courage to fix this broken system. History will vindicate me." The door slammed shut behind her, but her screams echoed through the courthouse for another minute. In the courtroom, stunned silence gave way to murmuring. Several victims' families were crying, not from sadness, but from something that looked like catharsis. They'd finally seen the mask come completely off. Within an hour, video of Taylor being dragged from the courtroom had gone viral. Judge dragged from courtroom after sentencing became the top trending topic. The footage, Taylor thrashing, screaming, being physically removed from a room where she'd once held absolute power, became a symbol. Not of persecution, but of accountability finally catching up to someone who thought they were untouchable. The aftermath moved quickly. State judicial oversight boards implemented enhanced financial disclosure requirements and random case audits. Ethics training became mandatory, not optional. Several attorneys who'd paid Taylor's consulting fees faced bar discipline proceedings. Civil suits started piling up. Marcus Webb, the wrongfully convicted man, sued for $12 million. Brandon Mitchell's family filed against Taylor personally and the court system for negligence. By December, 17 victims had retained lawyers. Judge Adams gave one interview after the sentencing, and his words became the case's epitaph. The greatest threat to justice doesn't come from outside the system. It comes when those inside it, those we trust most, betray their oath. So what do you think about Judge Carolyn Taylor's fall from grace? Was this justice finally being served? Or was there something more complex at play here? Could the system have caught her corruption earlier if anyone had been paying attention to those whispers among defense attorneys? And here's the real question that keeps me up at night. How many other judges out there are running similar schemes, manipulating cases behind the scenes, betting that their reputation and connections will keep them untouchable? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think 15 years was enough for someone who destroyed so many lives? Should Judge Adams have gone harder on her given the betrayal of public trust? And if you were on that jury, hearing all that evidence, would the verdict have been as easy for you as it seemed to be for them? If this story opened your eyes to how corruption can hide behind respectability and good intentions, hit that subscribe button. We're diving deep into more cases where people in power thought they were above the law, until they weren't. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments, and tell us if you've ever experienced bias in the courtroom, either as a defendant, victim, or just an observer. Your stories matter, and I read every single comment.